Good afternoon, welcome to This Week in Turkey. Today in the studio we're joined by Şebnem Arsu, who is a correspondent for The Independent. Welcome, Mrs. Arsu, once again to This Week in Turkey. Mrs. Arsu is also very closely following the June 23rd election, pre-election period in Turkey right now, and she recently published an article on The Independent titled, "Can Social Media Change the Course of Turkish Politics?" And in light of this article today, we will have questions for her as to how social media and fake news specifically is affecting the course of the pre-election period before the June 23rd local elections, the rerun of the March 31st local elections in Istanbul. And we'll look at how fake news and social media are affecting both candidates, both the CHP's Ekrem İmamoğlu and the ruling AKP's Binali Yıldırım. So before perhaps we start talking about how social media and fake news, as we have called out in the title of this episode in particular, before we start talking about that, let's try to cover very quickly and briefly what's been happening in the past couple of days regarding the candidates in social media, in Turkish social media. So CHP's candidate, CHP's mayoral candidate Ekrem İmamoğlu appeared on a show on Habertürk TV, a Turkish mainstream TV channel, a couple of days ago. And the answer he gave to one of the questions on that show was clipped and portrayed in a certain way and widely shared on social media, which in turn led to a sort of disinformation about what he was actually trying to say. And following this show, İmamoğlu faced a one-on-one protest in a pizza shop that he happened to be visiting as part of his campaign, and the owner of the pizza shop criticized Mr. İmamoğlu for the answer he gave on the TV show. But as Mr. İmamoğlu was trying to explain to the owner of the pizza shop that what he watched in social media was in fact not the reality, he encountered a sort of negative reaction from the pizza shop owner, and this little piece, this little video, it in itself became a piece of fake news as a gesture that Mr. İmamoğlu made to the owner of the pizza shop was portrayed as a slap in pro-government mainstream media and also in pro-government social media accounts. So this was this little video was shared with a title that said CHP's candidate İmamoğlu slapped a citizen, which in fact was not the reality. So this was a very brief and perhaps raw description of what happened. So maybe to make it easier for our non-Turkish speaking viewers to understand a bit better, we have a little video to share with subtitles, the video of the pizza shop, the conversation, the dialogue between the pizza shop owner and Mr. İmamoğlu this week. So we'll watch that video now and we'll be back with you in a minute.
Bu ülkeyi başkalarıyla yönetmek için mi tuttun?
Neyi başkaları?
Ülkeyi başkalarıyla yönetmek için mi biz böyle tuttuk?
Başka anlamadım dediğini.
Biz bu ülkeyi başkalarıyla yönetmek için mi biz böyle tuttuk?
Nasıl başkaları derken?
Geçen günkü gazetecilerin size sormuş olduğu soruda aynı şeyi söylediniz. Biz onlarla beraber yönetiriz. Neden olmasın diye.
Kim ne demiş mesela? Ne demişim?
Siz dediniz ya.
HDP ve dış ülkelere bir mesajınız var mı diye
Tamamını okudun mu sen? Dinledin mi tamamını?
Efendim izlediğimizi söyleyeyim.
Bakayım sen. Aç bakayım.
Başkanım çocuklar çıkacak.
Bak aç
Başkanım,
bak. Bak delikanlı öyle iftira atıp yok. Dinle bak. Dinle bak. Bak delikanlı dinle bak. Bak dinle. Sen hiçbir şey bilmiyorsun. Bir dinle.
Bırak ondan sonra.
Sen ukalalık yapma bana. Bak dinle bak şimdi bak. Bak. Bak
herkes-
tamamı dinle bak,
herkes
dinle,
dinlesin.
dinle.
Tabii herkes dinlesin.
Bir dinle sen, dinle.
Tamam,
Dinle.
sana beraber dinleyelim.
Hayatım sen dinle, sen dinle.
Doğru ya, kimse dinlemesin, ben dinledim.
Sen
Ben
dinle.
dinledim başta.
Sen bak altını yazın, dinle, oku
Ben
bak.
sonunda baştan sonuna kadar izledim.
Dinle bir-
babamdan da izledim.
Arkadaşım bir
Dedemden de
dinlemiyorsun bak,
Sizin
dinlemiyorsun.
zihniyetinizi de biliyoruz. Tamam. Hepimiz biliyoruz.
Sen dinlemiyorsun.
Dinlemek istemiyorum zaten.
Tamam hadi. Görüşürüz, hayırlı işler. Tamam delikanlı. Hadi. Ama bak dinlemeden bilgi sahibi.
Mrs. Arsu, in light of this short video of fake
Yeah.
news in action, how would you describe the role played by social media and fake news in particular in the course of Turkish politics right now?
Okay, well, actually it's a very broad question, but if to, put it in a nutshell, first, I think in order to understand what's happening in the social media, we have to look at what's happening in the mainstream media in Turkey. We've seen in previous elections the voice of the opposition going really dim and ruling party taking over the entire coverage in mainstream channel, which are predominantly owned by pro-government business groups. So in the absence of an opposition voice in the mainstream media, which is basically still the leading outlet for information for the majority of the population in Turkey, we're talking about 82 million people, the opposition grasped social media as a life jacket. And since 2013, we've seen the excessive use of social media during the Gezi riots, anti-government Gezi riots. And since then, there's been an increasing trend of social media becoming the voice of the opposition in Turkey. Having said that, this does not mean that social media is a place for the opposition circles or regular citizen to get reliable information. As unreliable as the entire internet world is, so are the social media outlets, especially when you look at critical issues like economy, politics, or other affairs that will affect people's day-to-day lives. The social media is a wonderful gem, yet to be looked at very carefully. And in there, we've seen a lot of fake news coming through the Turkish social media usage. Teyit.org, maybe some people would be familiar, has been tracing the level of disinformation in social media outlets religiously. And when I look at it, I personally get appalled by the way the raw information is shaped and edited to fit to the liking of a certain group in Turkey. So what we've just seen is an excellent example of that. I mean, you see how fake news actually can resonate in the society, especially at a time like this when the polarization in the society is reaching the peak point. So people are tense. There are very strong arguments on both sides of the let's say conflict, but the political spectrum, let's say, and whenever there is a little bit of material that the game players, let's say, see light in, they jump into it and they try to shape it the way it can serve their purposes. The problem that I see is there is a huge discrepancy between those who hold the mainstream channels and those that try to get their word out in a social media outlet. Because once they produce something in the social media outlet, the likelihood of that being taken by a mainstream channel is much higher than the material of the opposition. Meaning this video, for example, I'm sure it has circled in many mainstream channels showing, people's reactions against an opposition leader. So it's basically is a lingering issue, is a chain that needs to be broken by, those fact checkers. But then the problem is, would the people that should be checking those fact checkers be checking them or not? It's like, for example, Teyit.org follows, as I said, religiously one-on-one all the items, but is it being followed up? We see that that pizza shop owner was not keen to figure out what the reality is. So his preference is to go with the word, with what he says, what he hears, through a channel that he deems reliable. So it's a very hard game to play, but I have to say, Ekrem İmamoğlu, and that's what I try to portray in my story, has used social media in the most effective way. And not that the other leaders in the past, both government and opposition leaders, haven't, especially the government, especially the pro-government politicians have, the incredible resources, financial and manpower, to organize their campaigns both on social media and real world, in off and online media, let's say. But the difference that İmamoğlu brought to this entire campaigning world was his accuracy in online and offline. So his sincerity, his plain language, his one-to-one contacts that complemented each other, online and offline, made him a very successful online character, also in Turkish politics. We've seen his Twitter account jumping from 200,000 to 2.4 million, maybe more as of today. And his Instagram followers are up to 4.5 by now. So it is very exciting to follow. And it is also good that he not only did that, but during that short term that he served as the mayor of Istanbul, he opened the assembly, municipality assembly meetings to public, which has never done before. So meaning he allows the people to reach first-hand information, which then kills the possibility of fake news, one would say. But then you can ask me, how come the interview on Habertürk went wrong? Mm-hmm. That also shows that it can easily went wrong.
So far, we've focused on Mr. İmamoğlu and how his campaign is specifically centered in the social media. But from what we've gathered in your response, you've said that the social media happens to be the major outlet for opposition candidates, not only in the context of these local elections, but in any political context. In Turkey, social media, independent media, or let's put it that way, happens to be where the opposition talk is going on. But there's also a ruling party candidate in these upcoming elections, as would be expected, Mr. Binali Yıldırım, who's running for the ruling Justice and Development Party, AKP. How would you evaluate his campaign? Well, let's not call it campaign, let's not call it, well, we can call it campaign, but let's not call it social media campaign, but how would you look at his campaign in
or
general?
Maybe online strategy.
Online presence and strategy, yeah.
Well, the thing is, social media outlets do have, as far as I've been told by experts who are following the Turkish, social media scene, is very limited still. And we're talking about, up to 90% of internet use among young people, young people meaning anyone between 17, 24 years old, or maybe up to 30. But still, when you look at Heartland Anatolia, television is the strongest tool in getting the word out. When you go to a village, you won't see people, checking Twitter, but you would see the TRT or ATV or Kanal D open in a regular coffee shop. So we can never deny the importance and the influence of the mainstream media channels in Turkey. Twitter allows, not Twitter only, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, Periscope, all these channels, just allows maybe a breathing space for the opposition. It's not the place that the talk should be going on, but in the absence of nothing, social media comes up as the second best alternative. Binali Yıldırım and his campaign officials, I think, still do cover social media, but because they have more visibility in the mainstream media, social media seems to be in more lesser importance for them. Whereas for İmamoğlu or for any opposition leader, it's a different story. So I think we should, it's completely different actually. I mean, if İmamoğlu had the tools, had the chance to be visible or to be, covered in mainstream media every night, I'm sure it would have changed the dynamics of this election differently. I mean, fair enough. After the first round, before this rerun, we've seen İmamoğlu appearing in media channels much more than we've seen him before March 23rd. I mean, I personally didn't know him before he was nominated, so we all learned about him through the social media channel. I mean, that was also, there is some level of curiosity, so you go to the place where they offer you the information that you need. So that was a different story, but after this, before rerun, we see him appear more in mainstream channels. But then there's a strange questioning style that I encounter with my colleagues, that they seem to be missing the point that this is not a general election. This is a local election. I mean, they should be focusing on what would be different if İmamoğlu came to power tomorrow. What's his promises? What is his, projects that he's done in the past that could shed light on, his performance as the Istanbul. But that we don't hear. What we hear is what he thinks about S-400s, what he thinks about Kurdish issue, what he thinks about, economy. I mean, these matters being put forth also creates the impression that he is trying to be cornered in some way. And of course, I mean, that leads to material then gets re-edited in a way that serves the purpose for certain political motives, as we've seen. I mean, for example, him talking about PKK, him talking about FETÖ, it does not really have to do with Istanbul municipality run. So we see that either İmamoğlu is portrayed, it is also true that İmamoğlu is portrayed as a potential strong Turkish politician for future, which is true. But since if we're doing an election campaign story, I think it is interesting to see that mainstream channels, when they put the microphone to him, tend to be treating him as a general election candidate than local election.
So next, I was actually meaning to ask you about how you would evaluate how the mainstream media is treating the candidates at the moment.
Yeah.
And just like you've said in your response, unlike the March 31st elections, CHP's candidate, Mr. İmamoğlu, seems to be not so absent in the mainstream media in comparison. But what we're seeing is that I'm quoting you, obviously. It's as if the show hosts are trying to corner him with a certain style of asking questions. So would you agree that presence in the mainstream media for a candidate or for an opposition candidate, let's say in Turkey, is not enough on its own? It's also about how you're being portrayed and framed in the mainstream media. So, because up until this point, the opposition parties and candidates were always complaining about being absent in the mainstream media. But what we've seen when they were given space and airtime in the mainstream media is that this is serving a certain purpose. This is serving a certain goal that is more favorable to the ruling party.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, of course, I can't speak on behalf of the people who run these stations and who, produces these shows. But as a viewer and as a journalist, what I hear is quite one-sided questions and not allowing the leader to express himself the way that will mean something for the Istanbul electors that would vote, in a couple of weeks. So it's not only the questions. For example, in one of the mainstream channels, we've seen him being shut out the moment he was going to start talking about the findings that he has encountered during his short period as an Istanbul mayor. And that raises questions. I mean, of course, it will be interesting to do a research or a survey as to how the pro-government electorates react to these sort of programs or to this sort of questioning or this sort of appearances. Maybe what we miss, I think, in Turkey is this one-to-one debate that we once used to have. Like, we never see two candidates actually putting down their folders and putting their paperwork and talking about a solid issue. I think unless we see that on television, this, questioning, this shows it depends on how the host of the show directs the program. And so far, from my journalistic experience, it has not been a good report.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Mrs. Arsu will conclude our conversation on the upcoming June 23rd local elections, the rerun, and how social media is affecting the process. But we'll be back in the studio with Mrs. Arsu after watching our next video, which is on US-Turkey relations, in fact. In a phone call on Wednesday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and US President Donald Trump discussed Turkey's purchase of the S-400 defense system from Russia as Ankara risks sanctions and losing its F-35 deal.
The White House pool report says the two leaders will continue their dialogue at the G20 summit in Japan next month. According to the Turkish readout of the discussion, which is provided by the Presidential Communications Director Fahrettin Altun, Erdogan reiterated Ankara's proposal to form a working group to discuss the issue. Ankara has repeatedly raised the idea of an S-400 working group, and Pentagon has repeatedly dismissed it. Also on Wednesday, U.S. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus reiterated that Turkey will face very real and very negative consequences if it completes the delivery of the S-400s. Such consequences would include suspension of procurement and industrial participation in the F-35 program and also exposure to sanctions, Ortagus explained. Earlier this week, Turkey sent mixed signals about receiving its S-400 missile defense systems from Russia by June. The S-400 systems may not be delivered in June, but they are expected to arrive in the coming months, Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said on Monday. But the Kremlin spokesperson told reporters on Tuesday that there has been no change to the agreed-upon timeline. CNBC had reported last week that Turkey had until the end of first week of June to cancel its S-400 order with Russia and finalize an arms deal with the US or face penalties, including expulsion from the F-35 program.
Welcome back, Mrs. Arsu. You are actually a foreign news correspondent by profession, so it would be appropriate for you to continue answering our questions on what is next up in our news videos, which was the S-400 rift between Turkey and the US, as we've just heard. So this rift has proven to create almost unprecedented tension between Turkey and the US, and Turkey at the moment is facing the possibility of US sanctions over its S-400 purchase from Russia, and Turkey even risks being removed from the F-35 program, the F-35 fighter jet program. So where do we go from here, in your opinion?
Well, as you said, S-400 issue has been one of the thorniest issues in the history of Turkey-US relations for various reasons. But mainly, I think, in order to put the U.S. reaction into context, I want to repeat one one of the Turkey-US relations analysts that I've spoken with in Washington recently, and he has told me that the relations between US and Russia has never been any worse, including the times of the Cold War era. So if you actually look at the statement, it tells how profoundly the US part has been, how strongly they react to the deal that Turkey and Russia is engaged right now. It is not only the most advanced, missile system sitting next to US's, most advanced, let's say, war jets, F-35s. It's also politically, US and Russia are going through a very, very tough period. So all these added, I think, until the last point, meaning either dropping the deal or going forward with the deal, would be discussing this issue. S-400s, in my opinion, and the problems that surround it will not go away unless Turkey quits purchasing the missile system, which the Turkish officials say will never happen. So we are in a very difficult spot here. Turkey is not stepping back. US is not stepping back. But interestingly enough, I was talking to a Russian political professor, political science professor, and he had a very interesting take on the S-400 deal. He basically shed light on the Russian side too. So they said if the US is, or the NATO is concerned about their, advanced military equipment sitting together under the same shelter as the S-400s, it's the same concern for the Russians too. So Russians are equally concerned that their highly improved and advanced anti-missile system would be sitting together with the American warfare and war equipment. So there could be mutual intelligence loss. So there seems to be a disagreement between the Russian military and the Putin administration whether this missile system should be shared with Turkey, which is still a NATO member. So I think it has different layers to it. So if Turkey quit buying S-400s, would that be a huge rift between Turkish-Russia relations? According to the people who follow Turkish-Russia relations, it won't be so. It won't be so. It might even be a comforting step for Russia in long term. But we see that there is no such intention from the Turkish government along that direction, and they are eager to continue with the purchase. And although we've seen Erdogan and Trump agreeing on some kind of a dialogue to figure out what to do, I think one should not forget that there's also the power of Congress in the US that can actually impose sanctions on Turkey, and those sanctions would be very, very strong ones. We're talking about cutting trade link with a country that is deemed an enemy of the US, and Russia is one of them, North Korea is one of them. So if Turkey engages itself in such a strong defense deal, the voice that I hear from the Congress is very strong that sanctions would follow. I mean, we'd already seen the National Defense Authorization Act last week, for the moment, halting the transfer of F-35s to Turkey because of the S-400s. So whatever, of course, there's that unpredictable nature of Trump in the picture. And yes, he can, make things happen. but there is still different mechanisms in the US that can impose sanctions in Turkey that the government, I'm sure, is considering right now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Arsu,
You're
for
welcome.
your comments and for joining us in the studio today. This afternoon, we were joined by Şebnem Arsu, who commented on the role of social media and fake news also in the run-up to the June 23rd rerun elections, and also on Turkey-US relations in the context of Turkey's S-400 deal with Russia. And now we'll continue with our next news video. Turkey has released Serkan Gölge, a NASA scientist accused of belonging to a terrorist organization.
NASA scientist Serkan Gölge's nearly 3-year detention, along with that of several other US citizens, has soured relations between Ankara and Washington. Gölge was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison in 2018, despite State Department objections that he was convicted without any credible evidence. We welcome the news that Serkan Gölge has been released from prison today, State Department spokeswoman Morgan Ortagus told reporters. We will continue to follow Mr. Gölge's case closely, along with those involving our own locally employed staff in Turkey, she said, referring to the detention of several US consulate employees and other US citizens in Turkey on terrorism charges. Before his arrest, Gölge had worked as a full-time contractor on NASA's proposed mission to Mars. As part of the evidence against him, prosecutors had claimed to present links to the US-based cleric Fethullah Gülen. These included the presence of a $1 bill in his apartment, the fact that he had an account at a bank linked with the Gülen movement, and that he had studied at a university linked to the Gülen movement. Turkish government accuses the Gülen movement of masterminding the failed coup attempt in 2016, after which Ankara launched a sweeping crackdown. There are currently more than 30,000 people with alleged links to the Gülen movement in Turkish prisons, including judges, academics, and journalists. Last year, despite being NATO allies, Turkey and the US imposed tit-for-tat sanctions on each other's high-level officials over the detention of US Christian pastor Andrew Brunson. Brunson was arrested on espionage and terrorism-related charges, but was released in October and returned to the US.
The European Union released its progress report on Turkey for the year 2019 on Wednesday.
The report was shared with the public by the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Federica Mogherini, and EU Commissioner for European Neighbourhood and Enlargement Negotiations, Johannes Hahn. Johannes Hahn underlined that human rights violations have deepened and added that there has been regression in many areas, including the economy. The report said steps taken by the Turkish government have affected the markets negatively and stated that the Turkish economy has continued to advance on a severely mistaken path. The report also pointed out that there has been no advance in transparency for state aid and stressed that concerns regarding the independence of key financial institutions in the country have increased. Mentioning the rerun of the Istanbul elections, the report added that the election process in Turkey is not free from political pressure. Hahn also addressed the accession negotiation process with Turkey and stated that opening a new chapter is not foreseen for the time being. The EU Commissioner Hahn also added that the EU was not content with the refugee deal with Ankara and added that the cooperation continues in line with common interests. The first reaction to the report has come from Turkish Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Faruk Kaymakçı. Describing the findings and criticisms in the report as unjust and disproportionate, Kaymakçı has said that they will evaluate the report in detail in the Commission of Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately, the European Union does not approach Turkey in an impartial manner. It cannot detect the current situation in Turkey. The populist point of view has spread to the institutions, said Deputy Minister Kaymakçı.
Reuters reported this week that Turkey has delivered shipments of heavy weapons to the opposition forces in Idlib, Syria's last remaining opposition-held city. 5 Turkish Foreign Ministry staff detained last week on suspicion of links to the 2016 failed coup have said they have been tortured in custody, according to the Ankara Lawyers Bar Association. Several pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party HDP lawmakers and thousands of prison inmates in Turkey have ended their hunger strike following a call from jailed PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan.
The decision removed a source of tension after Ankara let Öcalan meet his lawyers this month for the first time since 2011. HDP lawmaker Leyla Güven began a hunger strike in November in a bid to end Öcalan's years of isolation by securing him regular access to his family and lawyers. People who have committed themselves to hunger strikes and death fasts, I expect you to end your protests, Öcalan said in a statement read out by one of his lawyers at a news conference in Istanbul on Sunday morning. On Wednesday, the lawyers visited him for a second time this month. Authorities had repeatedly rejected earlier requests to visit him, citing reasons including ship repairs and poor weather. In Diyarbakır, the southeast's largest city, a hunger-striking MP announced the end of the protest at a news conference. The lawyers' visits resumed a month before a rerun of the Istanbul mayoral election and prompted speculation of steps toward a new peace process 4 years after Ankara's talks with Öcalan on ending conflict. The decision to allow the lawyers to visit Öcalan was deemed by some commentators as an attempt by the ruling Justice and Development Party AKP to win over Kurdish voters. In the annulled mayoral vote in Istanbul on March 31st, the HDP had supported the opposition candidate Ekrem İmamoğlu, who narrowly beat the ruling party candidate Binali Yıldırım. However, Justice Minister Abdülhamit Gül has denied any such connection. Öcalan is the founder of the Kurdish separatist PKK, a designated terrorist group by Turkey, the European Union, and United States. Öcalan has been held in an island prison since the Turkish Special Forces captured him in Kenya in 1999 and is revered among Kurdish HDP supporters who see him as key to any peace process.
That's all from This Week in Turkey. Thanks for tuning in and hope to see you again next Friday at 5 p.m. Goodbye.